Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending where you're based. I am Rakhi Sarkar. On behalf of CIMA, Center of International Modern Art, may I welcome Rina Banerjee, Dr. Romita Ray, and all our attendees to this webinar on exposure to who across the world, deviation away from the center. I take great pleasure in introducing Rina Banerjee, one of the finest internationally acclaimed artists of recent times. She lives and works from New York City. Born in Calcutta, Rina left India as a 3-year-old to travel with her parents first to UK and finally to USA. After school, Rina qualified as a polymer engineer in 1993 from Case Western University, USA, and finally veered from the sciences and took her master's in visual arts from Yale University. Thereafter began the artistic journey. She never looked back. Rina has been exhibited widely in the USA, Japan, France, Italy, Singapore, India, United Kingdom. You mention any country, there she was always there, and many other countries. Her works have been featured in the Venice Biennale in 2017, at the Smithsonian, Washington, Philadelphia Museum, Museum Guimet in Paris, and the Whitney Museum, New York, and I'm sure in many other museums, and 13 biennales. Several leading museums across the world hold her works as permanent collections. Rina Banerjee's works speak to the world. And today we'll try and discover how and from where stems that remarkable worldview, her multifaceted creativity, and a little bit about her remarkable journey and the battles encountered. Incidentally, Rina is a fine writer as well. Many of her labels and titles of artworks, including the title of this conversation today, emerge as exciting literary interpolations with profound socio-political underpinning. In conversation with her will be Dr. Romita Ray, Associate Professor of Art History at the Syracuse University. Romita teaches European art history, art and architecture of the British colonial period in India, theories of Orientalism, post-colonial theories, and film studies. Above all, Romita has known Rina since their student days at the Yale. She has been familiar with Rina's works since their very inception. We therefore look forward to her revealing some interesting facets and providing sensitive insights into the various texts and subtexts underlying Rina's art. I'm confident she will cajole Rina convincingly to unveil and unravel her fascinating story. Our discussion today has been planned to be free-flowing, open-ended, and broad in scope. Both Romita and Rina have had wide experiences with art classes. Since a lot of our viewers today are young art students and emerging artists, the conversation hopes to touch on varied challenges facing the young art community, both intellectually and in existential terms. Given the current era of ideas, how does art negotiate with analysis, critical theories, and content in general? We also hope to touch on the relationship between artists and galleries and the need to forge international partnerships and interactions. We look forward to an exciting discussion and many probing questions from our viewers. I would like to remind all our attendees that you are most welcome to send your questions whenever you want to, but they will be addressed only after our discussion during the Q&A session. So over to Romita and Rina now.
Thank you, Rakhi, and thank you for inviting me into the conversation. I also wanted to mention that Rina and I have had a lot of fun collaborating with you on this project. And I'd like to remind everyone that as an art historian who works on the British Empire, I will be in conversation with Rina. This is not going to be a straightforward interview, in other words. So this will be Rina going forward with her ideas, with her critical insights. I should add, Rakhi, that after your generous introduction, that Rina needs no cajoling by me. In fact, it's probably going to be the other way around. She's the one that I learn from a lot, and she's our rock star for the day. So I will respond to some of the works that Rina will be showing you. So a conversation between two friends is how we've really envisioned this session more than anything else. The other aspect of Rina's work that you will see is the density of its details. Of course, one can go on and on about each one of her works because they're so multi-layered and multi-textured. So we will only flag some crucial thoughts that we can bring to the table today. Otherwise, we would be spending about 10 hours on this session. And thirdly, one of the remarkable, I think, aspects of Rina's work is that it's very authentic to her own life experience. And this is someone who unabashedly looks at herself, at her own life. So the work, I think, is an evolution of sorts. It weaves together many different voices from her own life, voices of her daughter, voices of her parents, voices of her grandparents. And I think that's what makes it very, very rich. And she will be unveiling some of these voices for you as we go along. So the whole point is, of course, to get exposed to Rina's life and to Rina's wonderful imagination. She has huge imagination, actually, and you will see that in the works that will be presented today. So speaking of exposure, I'm going to now hand over to Rina so that she can tell you a little bit about the title of today's session. So over to you, Rina.
Thank you, Romita, and thank you, Rakhi, and thank you for promising so much for our viewers and in anticipation of what we're about to share. And I wanted to start with, of course, the title, and the title is Exposure to Who Across the World, ? Deviation from the Center. And I want us all to realize exposure means just what we're doing today. All of us from various places coming together, sharing in great intimacy, both the personal as well as the public journey that we make when we leave home. And what does that mean in terms of the intellectual knowledge that we gain and the personal knowledge that we gain? And it also tries to imagine in metaphorical terms this idea of global warming. So we as the center think about land only, and hence the other parts of the world that we think less of because we don't live in the ocean and we don't live in the sky are those things. Those are also deviations from the center. And the center is a place where it is a place of origin for yourself, origin for your thoughts, your beliefs, what you have already accepted. To open yourself is to be exposed to other things that you don't accept yet, or do not have even knowledge of. I find myself looking back into the past to see the future and to understand the present by exposing myself to that variation in timeline from the ancient world to a futuristic world, what we hope and shape will be the future. So the original title is the large font that you see that we reduced my title to. So underneath in the smaller font, exposure to who across world and who among us find rare shelter, frightened to by our migration, deviation from center, when pencil puts each day that land holds above water, sky reaches above both, and bundles of commerce as bubbles painted, release free. And there is a kind of sense of both telling what I want to talk about in the title, but there is also a mixing, an entanglement that I refer to in the physical quality of the work that you see before you. And you can see the drag of threads, the overabundance of detail that merges in the work. And when you find that all this is way too much, that's when you begin your own journey as the audience, as the viewer, to think, what is this about? And those threads that you bring into the meaning of my work is your own personal experience, how you interpret. So I'm suggesting exposure is not only becoming aware of the world, but becoming aware of who you are when you enter that world. So I think with that, we can start the presentation, and I'll try to weave into it my own personal biography, the way I see my maturing into making art, and how different ideas were kind of digested to become concrete ones that I share with you.
Terrific. So just a couple of responses to that, Rina. I wanted to point out that both Rina and I were born in Kolkata. So I think we need to mention that in advance, since SEMA is a venerable Kolkata-based organization, and each one of us has taken different journeys. And what you're really talking about is how your journey from Kolkata onwards, and journeys that we all take in our lives, are journeys of diaspora, and how we make the world our own in terms of our exposure, how we then bring the world into our own sense of self, into our own sense of living, and certainly into our own transformations, right? So we'll start with the first slide, in which Rina will take us away into, you mentioned commerce, you mentioned journeys, and you mentioned entanglements. So if you could go forward with that, and then I'll respond to you afterwards.
Sure. I think, Romita, you mentioned a very important aspect in my work, which is the weaving of different things that don't necessarily go well together. And you'll see in my work this coming through with a sense of collage and assemblage that take place, and mixing of different materials, whether they actually go together or don't go together, creates a conversation about meaning itself. Meaning is derived when there is this kind of tug, this pull of one thing being one identity and another thing, another material being another identity. In this work, I started to really think about this dome, and the dome recurs as a larger form throughout the work in both sculpture as well as the drawings as a form. And this architecture of this bulbous thing, and you can even sense in the original title for this presentation, bubbles, for example, create this kind of echo that you'll see of roundness. And I think growing up in New York City, where you see these skyscrapers surrounding you, it's rare to see this bulbous form in architecture, but you do so in this colonial architecture, in the Mughal architecture, and the architecture of even the hut, where it is rounded off. It is a physical kind of phenomena that even the earth and all the planets have this bulbous quality, as does my head or my glasses, for example. And so we always have to really reference these two things, the one thing that is linear and the other thing that is bulbous. This work, which is called The World as Burnt Fruit, is both the fruit and the world, in a sense. And I'm really exploring this kind of melancholy place where all that is food that is made of the world itself is a gift to feed us, both physically, emotionally, and in every way that we can think of, to provide us with company, the animals, the plants. If all that could be lost, if it was burnt, I'm taking you almost to that point of not having that available for you. And so this work is kind of a jack-in-the-box form, where an animal is jumping out of the fruit So although the skin of this fruit, and you can see by the transparency of the linen fabric that it is a mosquito net that allows you to see inside what is very much alive. And so these feathers, these pigeon feathers that are dyed, and they're actually fans, they're Chinese fans. And that's kind of important to recall for me because they send us in a place of domestic objects, a handheld fan. And there, throughout my work, you'll see these kinds of objects. There's little gourds and there's glass brown vials. And the brown vials really refer to my grandfather in Dhaka. And I think that you can see it on this very right image, both the gourds that have been dipped in wax and pigment, light bulbs that have been discarded, which is also a domestic object, and they make the very throat of the alligator. The garhwal has in its mouth, in open teeth, in its skeletal form, this blackened globe, almost as a toy about to be eaten. So it captures this moment where the world may be eaten up, consumed, and that we've eaten too much, or that it's lost because of some crisis. So in my mind, I'm always like considering the appreciation of this worldview, that everything is one thing, both a place that is a home as well as the world as a home. And to be able to jet back and forth in your mind is to create a sense of intimacy with the world and a familiarity that you must demand. And so in the Jack-in-the-Box look of the alligator with its glassy throat, jumping out of this soft, feathery, fluttering inside, we have this fruit that lurks inside that must be had. And around the mouth of this fruit, where the fruit is opened up, you have these cowrie shells, and these cowrie shells then kind of echo the mouth of the alligator with its teethy projections that come out. And so all this is a kind of play, and there's a certain rhythm that you produce when you have that kind of repetition or echo. And there's these lit eyes. These are actual light bulbs in the eye that glow. And of course, it's a very funny sculpture as well. I do love to see darkness and absurdity and humor and playfulness all come together in the work. And for me, that was really important at the time in producing what I would say is work that both creates a new mythology about how we shape the future and how we see each other in different locations that we call home, but also to understand that all that is thought-provoking, intellectual, is also about our feeling. It is about our mind and our soul. And so all thought is feeling. If you have a feeling, you are already an intellectual person. And so I wanted to really shatter this idea of the intellectual being remote, and to understand that that is what all of it is.
Thanks, Rina. So a few responses to you right there. I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned about excess and also the title of your work, Burnt Fruit, because it's also the impossibility of eating something that's destroyed, right? Burnt. And it's particularly, I think, pertinent now for those of us who are living in America to hear the word burnt because of the California wildfires that are literally swallowing up land, people, plants, and animals. They're raging as we speak right now in the Santa Cruz area. And this goes back to Rina's point about global warming, climate change, and certainly the Anthropocene. And what's fascinating is all your multiple references, not just to the burnt fruit as you open it up to these Chinese fans, and the idea of excess and this sort of lush tropical site that we see there, right? But also the choice of the crocodile itself, as well as the homeopathic bottles that you've shown, which is, of course, plant-based knowledge as well. So there's a sense of extracting these very precious materials or very hidden animals, right? The crocodile being something that's an aquatic creature. And this, for me, as someone who works on the British Empire in India, is very striking because it brings to mind, for instance, scientific illustrations which expose this idea of discovery, the idea of stumbling on something that is hidden, and that transforms our way of understanding the world. It also creates these imaginaries, particularly exotic imaginaries, right? Of savagery, of the primordial, that India is stuck in this particular jungle-like environment. And yet the jungle has provided precious plant knowledge, has provided precious bodies for us to admire. So this question, I think, in your work that comes up a lot for me as someone looking at it is how bodies become sites of knowledge, how animals are also bodies, and how they have been traditionally commodified in, let's say, natural history collections, certainly in scientific illustrations, but also in natural history collections. And I'm showing you one of many. This is, in fact, the Indian crocodile preserved here in a very famous collection in Vienna. And I chose it because, of course, of those gaping jaws with the teeth-like protrusions and this idea of swallowing up, right? The burnt fruit represents, let's say, even the global burn of climate change, in which we see land, people, animals, everything being swallowed up in a sense. And so the gaping jaws sort of become a metaphor for that in many ways, of the Anthropocene itself, of swallowing up that excess. But in your work, what's also quite remarkable is we see the projection, right, of the crocodile. It thrusts out at us at any given moment. So whatever is taken in is also recycled out. It comes out in a different kind of form. And then, of course, a beautiful burnt globe that you're showing us. So the science of nature is what I'm seeing here, melded with the science of art. And since you have been also an engineer, I shouldn't say you have been, because I think that mind always remains with you. With that note, I was wondering if we could segue into how you think about the science of art and the art of science in your work as well.
Well, I think, Romita, the reality is that we're always aware of science because we're aware of our bodies first. And our bodies, in some sense, are always navigating how we interact with the world and if the world accepts our bodies. And so in that kind of arena where you have the one and the everything, you navigate the world and bring it to a manageable level by dividing up the world. And this is a very human impulse in order to have control in your own destiny. And I think that with engineering is very much about the application of that science. And the application of that science is a commercialization of science itself to make products in the world, which is very different than becoming a scientist who contemplates what is the world about, but rather how do we make the world sellable as well. And so that's the sort of engineering that I was really invested in the beginning part of my career that I bring into art making as well. So when we're making art, there is this kind of tug to make value of what we make. And we make value first if we love it. If we find, wow, this has to be art because I can't put a value on it. And so if you can imagine that kind of intimacy and that kind of overreaching value, it is in some sense a parallel to the way we see science. And when something becomes that value, it needs no language at all. It needs to be completely shared because it is really about the larger thing that is bigger than anything you've seen. And so my instep into art was very much interested in seeing art become global and international in the way science was for a lot of engineers. And at that time in the 1990s, in the 80s, where I was going to school and learning about art, before I really entered the art world, we didn't have art fairs, and we really didn't have the biennials that we speak of today. That has allowed, more importantly, for people to come together. And so you'll see in my work an interest in seeing how that happened within modernity. And so in this particular work, we have the background of the Columbia hospitals. And this is the Center for Disease Control. And you see a mapping, a hand drawn at that time, 1968, because this is a found drawing. These are mappings that engineers did, not architects. And the engineers then were modernizing all these buildings that were really old, our hospitals, our post offices, our banks. These are these grand places that are, in some sense, kind of a trophy of modernism, what modernism allowed, the centralization of these kinds of infrastructure that allows civilization to grow and to grow into urban places that became seats of migration for the whole world. And so it's a place of integration. And you can see the vent system drawn in the background of this figure, where the figure, very much like the alligator, lunges forward with all teeth. And her stringy red lips are about to burst open. And there is all this kind of pleasure and force of birth itself, as if the universe has opened up or flowered. So there is this central idea of the blossom in this. And in center of her carcass, or her in almost invisible or disappearing torso, is this blue earth. And so I'm also, just like the burnt fruit, the sculpture you saw before, bringing attention and seeing the whole world, not specific countries, not specific places, but to see it as an incredible and overreaching place that is also very mobile. And so the red and pink rounder objects that you see that kind of spiral and circle around the figure is in movement. And in fact, everything is in movement in this. There is no still landscape where the figure is grounded. And so the movement of things is what I display in the drawings, both of the air in the ventilation systems that bring healthy air or fresh air, as well as bringing sick air out. And so this preoccupation with controlling the inside of a building to find where its guts are, where its circulatory system is a kind of metaphor that I'm playing with between the world as it circulates through migration, the universe as it unfolds to us through science, as well as these buildings which become bodies themselves.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into what I was thinking as well, Rina, because I was thinking about the point you made earlier about our understanding of science oftentimes comes through our understanding of the body, our own bodies. And what's fascinating about this piece for me is that the breath that we take is our first sign of life, right? The first sign of arrival into the earth. And when we imbibe that air, we are actually connecting to our environment in very profound ways. And air is, by and large, invisible to us, right? So what's interesting here is that the figure becomes spectral, becomes ghostly, and sort of hovers above the drawing, the engineering drawing, but at the same time dissolves into the drawing. So in many ways, it's reflecting that idea of the body being connected to the air, of this also invisible infrastructure of a building, right? The tubing that you're talking about, the ducts, the air ventilation systems are actually hidden from our eyes beneath the skin of the building itself. So here, what you're weaving together very beautifully, I think, is the solidity of organic matter of our body, right? The human flesh, blood, bone, and then connecting it in this very ephemeral way with air which is invisible, which is the exact opposite, which is not solid the same way we think of it. So these hidden systems, the hidden breath of the body all come together. So as you said, body and architecture have this very interesting dialogue between them, right? The body can be understood as architecture as well. And a building can also be understood as a body. And I think that's the dialogue that's happening here too. What's also fascinating is this constant play that you have with translucency, those beautiful bubbles that come up, which are like stains on the paper, right? So you're materially embedding yourself into the paper itself. And the other thing is very apparent, I think, is how bodies themselves are spatial thresholds. And we forget that when we're inhabiting architecture, we constantly think of how we look at or outside of ourselves, whereas in fact, we ourselves are spatial thresholds. And one of, I think, the questions that comes up quite frequently in your work is how we form attachments to place, right? That how do we either deviate from place, or how do we keep coming back to it, or how do we do both? So I wanted to end my remarks with what a very famous Chinese American geographer, Yi Fu Tuan, wrote about space and place, and that is, place is security and space is freedom. So I'll let you think about that when we move into your next piece here.
I love that quote. I think the reality is these things that are very different, opposite, a place, and to be released from place, to receive freedom, has its own kind of dangers and in exchange. And I think that in between place where you have both is everyone's wish to have everything. And definitely I think of the body as being made of air and water and mass, in the way that the planet is made of sky and ocean and land. And so I'm always creating these kind of new intimacies with other things that relate to our body. So we understand how these three things have to stay together to have what we have as life. And I think this idea of exposure creates really large amounts of fear and anxiety about what is the end of what we call human existence. And the threat of human existence comes with everything from self-identified, self-propagating struggles, which is our relationships with each other as people, from country to country, from neighbor to household, within families itself, to have these kinds of intimate relationships where you're dependent on each other, but you also require each other's distance in order to secure this freedom away from that security. One of the things that brings security when you are released home is a sense that you will have an opportunity to collaborate when there is a crisis. And the collaboration is this thing that allows us to see ourselves as a whole family in the whole world. And that includes plants and animals and the sky and the water and our neighbors. So in thinking about that, in 2000, this particular sculpture that you see before you was made as a commission to the Whitney Museum of American Art. And for the first time, I found the museum to consider what it is outside of America that exists. What is the rest of the world like, and how our art needs to speak to the rest of the world. And so it was an opportunity for the museum to restructure the way they select curators where the curator of this particular Whitney Biennial, which is every 2 years, would always be an in-house curator. And for the first time this year in 2000, they chose 5 curators. And that is a big jump. In a sense, this kind of exposure was the first exposure for New York City to the rest of the United States as these little locations that were once ignored. And so these 5 curators allowed a diversity of artists of various background, artists who were from other parts of the world, not born in the United States, to come together in this exhibition. And so the exhibition itself was a new opening, a new exposure. I wanted to make a work that would allow me to talk about this new entry point into the world. And at that time, it was AIDS that was the big crisis in New York City specifically, because the rest of the United States didn't believe they had a problem with AIDS. And ironically or coincidentally, the New York community didn't think that once it had all the pharmaceutical products necessary to contain this particular disease, it had to worry about Africa and India and what was escalating in these parts of the world. It ignored that. So this is a very interesting thing, because we're talking about opening up not only to the world outside, but what you inhabit, you know, who your neighbors are. So I made this piece with the same engineering drawings that make the background, and you can see its shape is very organic, and it references these deities that I had seen in India. There were these black granite temples with beautiful figures that were climbing out of foliage, banyan trees, mangoes, all kinds of animals, and kind of like paradise, you might say, I imagine. So I brought this kind of worldliness, this kind of forest of things to be reckoned with disease itself. And so what you see is these yellow tubes, the kind of tubes you would see in hospitals, in laboratories, that are very much part of the pharmaceutical trade, and references circulation itself, migration. How much disease is not only connected to migration, but is an evidence of our own migration, which we are not ready to make note of or to embrace. And so the figure is a figure that looks also very insect-like. It doesn't have legs. It has a bottom body, which in insects are often the whole digestive system. So again, I'm talking about air and digestion, consumption, commerce, all these things that connect us to a different place that we're not always ready to confront, or are too provocative for our own minds to grasp. And you see here in this image, the floating floor. This material itself is very skin-like. It has a translucency, if you will, and you can see both the stone underneath as well as the staining quality that is Romita was talking about, where you really physically have to rub in with the powder. And I'm using both turmeric to color the tubes yellow, to talk about sterilization, which, you know, I grew up with my mother really talking about turmeric and its qualities. And I also grew up with my mother giving me knowledge about rangoli and drawing and painting out of things that were already at home. And so this red here is shidur or kumkum powder that is kind of smeared, and then I make these plasticine rolled things that maybe you would make in a kitchen if you were making pasta, or if you were making, you know, with my mother, I would make these decorations for shandesh. So all these personal ways of making things really come into the work. So it's not only studio practice as I've learned in school, but also what have I learned to do with my hands and how can I use that to make art?
Wonderful. So here we are, since you talked a little bit about Rangoli and especially the hand, and I wanted to return to the idea of skin. One thing to keep in mind, this is for the entire audience here, is that this is the work that caught Rakhi Sarkar's attention. So it has a very special place within the conversation that we are presenting to you. So it's the entry point for Rakhi Sarkar into Rina's world, right, of art itself. So I just wanted to point that out. So back to the idea of skin and also paper, which you're using, is very much parallel to skin, right? And there's this transferal of your body onto the skin of the paper because of that very tactile quality of your work. You're working with your hands constantly. And it reminded me, of course, of Alpona drawings, in part because your particular piece over here doesn't just stop at the wall or at the ceiling. It actually spills out into the floor itself. And so this is something else to think about when we think about a very traditional Indian, I would say, art of Alpona drawing or Rangoli drawing. Alpona is, of course, what we call it in Bengal. But since you are also a Bengali, fellow Bengali, we are all fellow Bengalis on this conversation today. There's something very interesting about the food elements, the culinary elements that you're drawing in. You gave us a reference to your mother making shandesh, to also turmeric or holud. And then we think about Alpona as something that's made out of rice flour, right? So there are all these organic elements that refer back to the body itself, to things we ingest. And food ultimately transforms us too, right? So you have bhat or rice, which is so typical of the Bengali diet. You have holud or turmeric. And of course, you've got shidur, which is very much a bodily kind of ornamentation of sorts. So very interesting way of sort of merging your work, I think, rather inadvertently, right? These are all happy accidents that have come along in the way in which your personal identity as a diasporic artist actually plays into your work without you probably even realizing it, which is quite magical in and of itself. The other thing that really caught my eye over here, and let me just go back to the overall slide, is the way in which you guide us to look through these entanglements, right? You've got all these delicate thread-like formations. And although this looks to us like clutter, it's actually very carefully organized clutter, right? Very hard to pull off in an installation. And so your eye is constantly moving between those sort of floating threads, this entangled mess that we see, and between that and then these, again, the spectral contours, the ghostly contours of that outline deity-like figure. So we're moving between different optical experiences at any given moment, which makes it very exciting. The other thing that you brought up earlier is this notion of entanglements. And of course, we're living in the age of the pandemic, which is all about how the virus is traveling from one body to another. So it's a very appropriately chosen work to discuss right now, because the previous big moment in American history, of course, was the anxiety around AIDS itself as this infectious mode, right? And it's very much about how a virus or a disease connects different bodies, jumps from one host to another. And so I think the work that you're showing us here is very much a metaphor for that traveling disease. And it also opens up the infected body, right? The infected body itself internally is filled with, again, infections. It's filled with a different level of entanglements inside itself. So we can step out of the body and see how the work reminds us of an infection that travels from body to body, creating these entangled networks. At the same time, we can look within the body itself. And this is something else, I think, that is very evocatively, I think, spoken of by the Slovenian theorist right now, Slavoj Žižek, who's written a book already about the pandemic. And he calls the coronavirus, for instance, a spectral fantasy. So he thinks of it very much as this imaginary bogeyman, which is what you're also bringing into your work all those years ago, right? And last but not least, since you talked about the deity-like figure, this shadowy deity-like figure in the background, I think disease also gives us a sort of reverence for the body. We are afraid of its loss, and so we revere the infected body in a very interesting kind of way, right? And the physical, again, those threads that float above our heads reminded me also of a banyan tree of sorts, the temple-like structure of a banyan tree, the architecture that houses a deity itself. And the banyan is also a form that returns us to the primordial, right? To our most primeval selves, which are ultimately concerned with survival, with the idea of how do we return to that place of fear, of survival, so that in fact we outlive a pandemic or we outlive an infection. So here I want to segue into your next piece of work, thinking about the body as a depository of memories, because ultimately an infected body becomes an imprint, right, of the infection, becomes a repository of those memories. And so too does architecture. So if we can now think about architecture as a manifestation of memories that particular bodies actually bring to them, and onto your spectacular palace of love over here.
Well, there's nothing more insecure than having your place be invaded by other places, other identities. Souvenirs, in some sense, like souvenirs of the Taj Mahal, become a way of having control over those places that are far away, but bringing them safely and securely under your possession to be had. So you can have the whole world as long as you take it as the person who is the owner and have in your home what is not yours. And so it is a very different way of receiving a souvenir than if you were, for example, in my case, Indian, but also enjoying the souvenir and bringing it to the United States. So these are very complex ways in which I'm seeing souvenirs through the authority and the ownership of the person who is the buyer. And so in this particular house, the Guimet Museum was a house built by the French people, and they were a family. And they were a family that went to Asia in travels to secure goods. And they secured everything from sculpture to jewelry to textiles to artifacts, and brought it back home for this house. And so it's amazing to me to see in the gallery that was the library their story of finding a museum, what museums are really about. And so all museums have this note of taking from the world and bringing back home safely for viewing and examining, and to possess the world outside without leaving home. And so I'm very interested in this way of how the onlooker experiences those places away. And so the pink Taj Mahal I made for this particular entry area, which is the lobby of the Guimet, where Southeast Asian sandstone sculpture usually are displayed. And so I thought it was very eventful to bring actually a housing and the architecture where perhaps these sculptures would have been in a temple, but the temple is absent from their location. And so the lobby itself, its stone-like and cool area kind of mimics this original temple that would have been the housing for these sculptures. So I brought this pink, very warm plastic housing, the pink Taj Mahal, to this space. And I really thought about how much we've forgotten that these souvenirs, the sculpture that we now call art, meant to them. What did it mean to them? What does it mean today? And so my souvenir, the Taj Mahal, is something that I maybe saw once before I actually made this replica. And my intention, of course, was not to make it in its exactness, but to recreate it for my own possession and for the sharing in the art space. So my pink Taj Mahal is very skin-like. It is not permanent. It is temporal. It floats. It's very lightweight. It's made of visible tubing that is strung together. And in some sense, it hangs like a chandelier from above. And it dispenses light in this rosy manner. So when you look through the windows of the pink Taj Mahal, all that you see is colored. So all these things were thought about, this rose color lens that souvenirs allow you to see the world as very different from its original place. The movement of objects and the movement of people, movement of animals and plants are very much a part of the colonial era. And in doing so, it created a constellation of movements that never really took a place of rest. And what happens when things move is they lose meaning and they gain meaning. And the losing and the gaining forges new entanglements. And as you can see, these bulbous plastic balls that fall on this chair, which appears like an ornate throne, begins to talk about how power changes with excess of movement. So power is therefore cannot be complete. There are windows, like the many windows of this pink Taj Mahal, in which to see perspectives that are always colliding, collaborating, and hence the change and transformation that you receive when this migration takes place is an enormous thing to behold and to understand, especially in the contemporary world where we have knowledge of so much information.
Okay. So I wanted to pick up on three aspects of your thoughts. One was the color pink itself, which is, of course, very quintessentially Indian. We talk about Rani pink in India, this very bright jewel-like color that we're seeing. And what's fascinating is that you're playing with this color through plastic sheets, right, that you've pressed with your hands at times. So again, that idea of skin and tactility and your body actually merging in some ways with your creation, right? Those hand imprints themselves, which create these wonderful translucent effects. But the color pink also reminded me of jewels, of rubies, which of course adorn much of Mughal jewelry itself. And we can't take the building away from the Mughals because after all, Shah Jahan, the man behind this particular monumental building, was very much a gem connoisseur himself. So what's fun about your work, Rina, and this is something that I wanted to tell the audience, is that so much of your work is about instinctively responding to these very interesting paradigms of Indian art and architecture without your being burdened in some ways by the art history behind it. So I think the wonderful coincidence of your using the color pink weaves its way, of course, through art history, which is why I'm finding it quite fun to also respond to your thoughts and to how you have conceived of these works. So color, very, very important. And the idea of tactility, the idea that you yourself have pressed those cellophane panels together to create this magnificent new pink Taj Mahal as such. So what you're seeing here, just for those of you who are interested, is one of Shah Jahan's thumb rings, which is now in the Hermitage Museum collection in St. Petersburg. It's a thumb ring that he apparently wore while stringing or while shooting a bow, an arrow, shooting an arrow from a bow. So just a little thought in there. The only piece of the actual Taj Mahal that I'm showing you here, many of you are familiar with, of course, the extraordinary Pietra dura work that adorns the facade, and that's what you're seeing in the upper left corner, detail of that. Which brings me to my second point, and you have all seen this, I think, in Rina's very articulate shall we say, presentations about her own work is the aspect of skin and tactility. Because we can think about the Taj as this marble-clad building, with marble actually being the skin of the building itself, right? And onto that skin, various hands have worked to insert these semi-precious stones to create this jewel-like effect. Again, sort of your own work, Rina, on the Taj, on the Pink Taj, actually echoes this idea of how you're working with the skin of a building itself, right? The blood and the sweat and the manual touch that goes into recreating this. So you're kind of evoking, however inadvertently, again, the hundreds of hands that have actually worked on the actual Taj Mahal itself. And the third figure, the third aspect, of course, is the figure of Shah Jahan himself. We all saw in Rina's work the globe that has been a recurring feature. And I wanted to remind us of how the Mughal emperors also envisioned themselves as great emperors of knowledge and of semi-divine power. So here you see Shah Jahan standing on a terrestrial globe. I won't decode the image for us because, again, that will take us way past our time. But I at least wanted to flag these for us, and two other very important details connected to Shah Jahan himself, which you have yet again inadvertently drawn into your work, which is the throne. The Taj itself is considered the throne of God in Islamic theology, according to Islamic theology and our historical readings, the throne of God on Judgment Day in the gardens of paradise. And here you are giving us literally a throne suspended, right, from the ceiling of the Taj. One is that. And number two is the famous peacock throne, which sat actually in the Red Fort, which was commissioned by Shah Jahan. So you're actually, for someone who is familiar to a certain extent with the history of the Taj, you're pulling out these threads for us literally without you even realizing it, which is what makes this quite magical. And so the wonder of creating the Taj Mahal, I think, as you said quite eloquently, is also about making it your own. And one of the most striking aspects of the Taj, of course, is that it has been made into endless souvenirs, countless souvenirs. So it becomes a building that is in fact portable physically in these versions of the Taj, as well as in the imagination, which is where your work comes in, right? It's both portable as well as imagined. And what's fascinating, I think, is the fact that the Taj, the pink Taj that you have recreated, floats like a toy balloon. So yet again, that playful dimension that you mentioned. And I couldn't help, since we are both from Kolkata, flagging Abanindranath Tagore's spectacular 1902 painting, The Passing of Shah Jahan, where he also imagines the Taj Mahal in the background. And this is, of course, Abanindranath Tagore imagining and reclaiming the Taj in his own artistic way, right, within his own artistic framework, which is what you're doing too. And the painting, of course, is in the Victoria Memorial Hall in Kolkata. I just thought I would put a shout out for that. So speaking now of imagining, sorry, Rina, go ahead.
I wanted to add, I think when I first saw the Taj, I actually saw it as a souvenir first before seeing the actual building. But I saw it very early in the morning, and I was really enamored by how much it looked like a cloud, that it almost disappeared into the mist. And when I made the pink Taj Mahal, I wanted to do quite the opposite of what it was. And so I wanted to make it more fleshy. And therefore the skin is very important, the color in terms of grounding it as here. And also that it's temporary, that it is not going to live forever. And in fact, the stone of the marble white stone of the Taj Mahal really sends this message that this building is forever. And I think those two things were really important in deciding, you know, some of the trinkety quality of the pink Taj, that it is a toy for us to imagine.
Speaking of toys, now we move on to a different imagination that you've applied to the Taj, which is in this particular installation where the Taj becomes almost insect-like. So if you could take it away, Rina, from here.
So here, this is a triennial that I've been asked to participate in. And usually in triennials, they very much want you to do what you want to do. And so you have very many field visits where you come and you talk to various people, ask questions, see what you want to use to make your work. I, in this situation, wanted, after spending a month in Japan, to make a Taj Mahal, because the people there did not know what the Taj Mahal was. And to make that very obvious, this particular town, Hachi, where you see this green Taj Mahal in the housing of an elementary school that had been abandoned, is very much a town of elderly people. And that meant that the average age in this town was 93 years old. And they were a town that had seen Hiroshima, World War II, and had survived all those things to hit another crisis, which is the booming of Tokyo. And so all the families from this town had left, leaving them, the elderly, to themselves. And so there was a kind of grieving for the young children, the schools that had to close. And I wanted to make a piece that was both monumental to anchor this loss. As you know, the Taj Mahal is, you know, a tomb in some sense, as is the elementary school that you see before you. And in speaking to the people in the town, they had these materials that were called mosquito net housings. They were square housings made of this green linen mosquito net. The linen was made in the town in factories that used to be really very much a big a business in the area. But now people don't use those kimonos anymore of linen that was very much the clothing of the time, because it was their ethnicity that was being discarded, being shed, to create a sense of being in the modern, as many places were in the world. And so they were able to give me these mosquito nets, really interested in this kind of pleasure they took post-Hiroshima, which is a tea ceremony. In the tea ceremony, it was really something that was made into tradition. They shaped it, they invented tradition. So I think it really unravels our ideas of tradition being from the very distant past and not of our own making. So in a sense, I am bringing the tea houses into the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is the place for the tea ceremony to begin again. And it's made into this insect that has entered the school. And in some sense, the insect itself is a kind of deity, the way I see it. And we went into the forest very much to look for this greenish bamboo that would match in color. And there, the green bamboo is very bendable, and it looks like antennas that come off the green Taj Mahal. And then there on the bottom, as you see, as the Taj Mahal is floating, the legs are the multiple legs that you might see in an insect, but are ceramic horns that were also handmade. And inside, instead of the throne of the pink Taj Mahal, you have the school chairs that were in the geography class. And inside, tucked in the major dome, which is the centerpiece of the Taj here, you have the globes that were once in the geography class. And the geography class for me was a place where you learned about the world, but also within the framework of this hierarchy, as I recall it in my classroom in, I think it was 9th grade that I had geography. And in a sense, you're learning imperialism itself. these classroom chairs were brought from the United States. They were not made in Tokyo. So in a sense, it's a beginning of the world being niched for certain products, and then making a souvenir of that product. If you go to this country for this and this country for that, what you're doing is making a country into a store. And so the stores have one or two products, or maybe they have all the products. And so the manufacturing world and the handmade world are beginning to do this dance as it continues today. And in center, what you see lit and that lingers to the floor itself, touching it, are these glassware from the science class, which also centralizes science as part of the West, where Eastern or alternative sciences, as we mentioned, homeopathic, are not the center of attention. That is not the real medicine. That is not the real science. And so these kinds of dances are happening between past, present, and the event of modernity that unfolds in this piece called The Lore of Place. So the lore of place is about how places become also a place of extreme commerce and value, where currency is made not of the land itself or what is made in the land, but of the people. How much are they worth?
So Rina, one of the most poignant aspects, I think, of this particular sculpture is that we are actually in the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. And I know that in this particular piece, there was a very unique cultural collaboration. So if you could talk for a few minutes about that and the imagining of the Taj.
I was really interviewing, or just really talking to, I don't want to even use the word interview because I didn't have specific questions. I went from door to door and spoke with the townspeople, the elderly, and they really, I was the only one living in the town who's also working on the project in an apartment. And they really took care of me. They showed me how to sew, to bend, to really learn how to make the piece. And it was really important to hear their personal stories at the time, how they managed their isolation for them from rest of Japan at the time, and continues to be now a real problem where no one wants to come there. The neglect allowed them a certain kind of treasure. To be very frank, the treasure was their own intimacy and their own shaping of their future, their destiny. So this is a village that was really a whole family. And their openness for foreigners was intensely full of generosity and love, which I can't say Tokyo felt that same way. The sense of ego that remains part of the facade of a city is also not really easy to realize, because, you know, I've grown up in cities all my life. When you come into a big city to do a project, it's very hard to know the city of individuals. And so going to the village is where I learned about who Japan is, in a sense. And I thought that was pretty amazing to discover.
So speaking of discovery, I think the other point that you have made when you and I have discussed this particular sculpture, I feel like it's a monumental work of architecture itself, is the fact that how surprised you were that people in Hachi didn't know what the Taj Mahal was. So you were in some ways rediscovering the Taj with them, right? And here we forget that sometimes knowledge is very uneven across the world, or we prioritize different kinds of knowledge. That the Taj may mean something to us in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan and perhaps in the West, but in a remote part of Japan, it may not make sense at all. So that kind of gap that you filled is very compelling over here. And that actually brings me to just two buildings that I wanted to flag again, because I think Rina has, in the process of recreating her imagined version of the Taj, in this case, of course, in Hachi in Japan, I think it tells us a lot about how we as humans imagine new identities for specific sites, right, through buildings, and how buildings themselves extend their legacies, their memories into our space of history, our understanding of history and geography at the same time. So when you talked about drawing the tea house from Hachi into the Taj Mahal, it brings to mind two buildings. One is this particular replica of the Taj built in Sonargaon in Bangladesh by a movie producer, I believe, Bangladeshi movie producer, for those who can't visit the Taj in person in Agra. And the other one is our beloved, the Taj of the Raj, the Victoria Memorial Hall, very much a building that also reminds us, and in fact was built out of marble that was quarried apparently from the same quarry that supplied marble for the Taj Mahal. So, you know, here we have this concept also, I think, in your work, which is reflected in these two slides I'm showing you as well, is this notion of beauty and how, and Elaine Scarry has a beautiful reflection on this, that beauty tends to replicate itself. There is this urge to constantly bring beauty back, right, in all these myriad forms. And I think that's precisely in the end what you are also doing with your insect-like Taj, recreating that beauty for us as well. So with that, and the idea of how people and place intersect to create new histories and geographies, I thought we could move on to your last piece of the day.
So this is a project that was really very exciting for me. It was exciting because it was a point where I felt I could use the same idea of history, but more literally to use primary sources. And it was exciting because I was able to work with my daughter, and she was very much part of the experience of understanding our migration and her curiosity for our migration to the United States. My daughter, Ananya Kumar Banerjee, was studying at Yale, and her area, ethnicity, race, and migration, took her to a professor who was interested in the migration of Black Bengalis, as they were called. And these were Bengalis who came on from Calcutta. They were called Hooghly networkers, and they trafficked this rich commodity of fabric, textiles, silks. These silks were very coveted because of the embroidery on them that were made by the women in their villages. And they were not allowed to sell them because of British rule in India, that Indians could not sell their wares. And so that kind of resistance by the Hooghly networkers meant escaping India and coming to the United States, to the port of New York, the Harlem River. And there the ships docked, and the Bengali men came abroad in New York and then later dispersed to major cities in the United States. They married and were welcomed by African Americans who were coincidentally at the time in the 1860s, were coming from the South and migrating north, escaping slavery and escaping their past. And in making their future, they were very much part of American identity today, because they created a way for inventing how to also resist the laws that were in place in the United States, specifically the Jim Crow era, which forbid them to sell any goods. So they made business because they were able to send the message in marrying these Bengali men, they were Asian. And the Bengali men in marrying the African-American women were then Black. And so Black Bengalis were quoted as such in Louisiana consensus reports. And so there was this new information of identity that was happening because of migration and mixing. And so I created this one specific person that I read about. Her name was Viola Ida Lewis. And she had a dry goods store in New Orleans. And she was married to a Bengali man. And they had a beautiful home and children, and who continue to live in the United States, their relatives. So this was a real person for the first time that I'm using in my work. And the way I create her in this particular sculpture is she's a rescue worker. She not only is rescuing the Bengali man from his peril, running away from the British, but she's rescuing the country. And I think today, especially with Black Lives Matters, it's really relevant to how different people contribute to making a place a functional place and a place of richness and wealth. So culture, we often don't really attribute to one person or the other, but in essence, the culture is made of many things. And it's very much like the weaving of these textiles. They have the kind of wealth of many hands having had play in it. And so you see Viola, the figure, as an insect, very much like the sculpture of the Whitney Biennial, a body with wings, two mirrored sconces, which are early American sconces, black Murano tusks that were made in Murano, rakes that are Indian rakes that are her arm, a Congo currency elbow bangle, apple seed necklaces that I got from India, and Korean wedding dresses that make the majority of the silks that are used in her wings. And you can see the pull of strings that look almost silk-like that are part of this parachute. So she is a rescue worker that's landed with parachute falling to the floor. And she's ready to do the work of cultivating a new place, a new world, the United States, the Americas, into a place that is multicultural.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Rina, for taking us through this extraordinary journey of your life, your thoughts. And what's particularly memorable, I think, is how you work with such a wide variety of objects which are so carefully chosen, which comes out in the last piece that you discussed. And as a historian of art, I can say that you really make us think about how personal histories can become public memories and public geographies and sites. So we will conclude with that right now. I know we're running a little bit behind time, but thank you all for indulging our duet, our adda or jugalbandi, however way you wish to phrase that. And now on to the second part, which will be between Rakhi and Rina. So please take it away. We'll keep the slides up so that they can refer back to some of Rina's work if necessary.
Well, Rina, I mean, the first time when I heard about you was actually, not heard, I confronted you actually, first time. That was during the Whitney Biennale, that was in 2000. And before that, to be very honest, I wasn't aware of your work, or I wasn't familiar with your work. And when I walked into this room, the spectacular glimpse of this, I hadn't even read the label, I didn't know who this work was by, forget about your bio, I never even had any idea at that stage. As I walked into this room and I saw this fantastic piece of work, which was of course the infectious migrations, I mean, instinctively, I mean, before I even knew about you, I felt, oh my God, I mean, this is like a fantastic engineering feat, you know? Who is this artist? I mean, it's almost like an engineering feat, because as I walked close, though mind you, from a distance on the screen, it seems like these beautiful dangling yellow ropes, but they're not actually yellow ropes. They're mostly these tubes. And to even, you know, to set it on this wall and to do it, it's all very lovely when you see it all done. And you think, oh, what a delicate and beautifully based structure this is, but to be implementing this, it wouldn't have been possible unless a person like you who had that engineering background. Do you think this background of yours has helped you in these? Because at the end of the day, when you conceive of something and you deliver it, it has to be perfect. It can't be this way or that way. It has to be perfect. Do you think your engineering background somehow helped you in that? Your scientific background helped you in your ultimate delivery of the fantastic artworks that you do?
Well, I often think about science because I have to. It's functional, because when you work with different materials, you really have to know your materials, what their limits are, what they can do. But there's also an experimental part of working in the studio where you can explore things with not knowing very much about them. And so there is a kind of parallel world between working in a lab and working in a studio, where you bring these ingredients together and through observation, trial and error, and just the pleasure of being focused on them, you can understand what they can do. But what the ingredient that you add with the visual arts is meaning itself, that you are constructing meaning in the way that an architect constructs a building. And of course, that building can only function if people want to come in it. And so beauty then is a means of not only producing the lure of wanting to look at a work, because it is a still work, but it's also the very point at which meaning begins, that its beauty is not decorative. And so all these messages really allow you to untangle the very language that is very active in all cultures, what is meaningful and what is not. So you're really constructing and reconstructing, reorganizing currency of value around or surrounding meaning. And so that allows a lot of play, I suppose. I think the materials I use have their limits, and sometimes the limit itself is an interesting place to be when a material really falls apart. So I didn't shy away from textiles when they were very much discouraged in contemporary art. I didn't shy away from seashells, for example, that I use a lot in my work, feathers. These things were frowned upon in contemporary art because they didn't feel they could last. So my argument, because I was in science, I was very aware how things like linen and organic materials, actually we have more knowledge about them than we have of synthetic things. And they can last thousands of years. And so at that point, it was very clear to me that how long a thing lasts is not always the most important thing. And so really we want things to last not because of the museum, but because of the market of exchange. How often can I resell this for gain? And you really have to think about what's also important in making things in your own life is not always to do with money. And I think you and I have spoken about that, about the commercial market and philanthropy and nonprofits. And what is it that motivates us to make art if it's not money? And so I think that opens up for all kinds of experiments to see who we are as human beings in the world of commerce.
Thank you. Another thing that always, it's very relevant for our young artists. I mean, I always meet them in our art center. And the one thing that they are constantly encountering is the tremendous burden and pressure of theory, and particularly the face of biennales and all that, where a lot of curators are, they are stressing a lot on ideas and, on theory and all that. So, your work is so beautifully nuanced. There's so much of history. There's so much of theory interwoven into the fabric of your work. Now, being a practicing artist and also being a person who taught in the classroom, would you have something to say for our young artists here?
Being a young person is not an easy thing to do. And I think when you're young, the pleasure of making work and finding out the work you will be doing is so valuable. I think it's so important to guard that freedom as a young person to experiment and to lose yourself in what interests you. To hear your own voice is so important. Curators come to hear what it is you are interested in. And what you are interested in can't be had if you are overwhelmed with all the voices that are in the world. And so choosing and disregarding is something that you have to entertain in your space. And your space should be a secure place for you to roam as well. And I really think it's very important to have other artists. I still have other artists who are younger than me, older than me, talk to me about my work. Curators are not the only people who should be in that space. And they could be your neighbor, your girlfriend, your family members. Everyone is, if they are connected to you, have interest in you, will be sending you messages. And I think, you know, like my site-specific work, I continue to do what I practiced as a young person in the studio to learn how to talk to the town of Hachi, where everyone is 93 years old and had a completely different way of life than I have. And you can do that if you're really open to ideas without having those ideas being forces that really silence you. So remember, people are adding to your vocabulary in a conversation, that there can be no hierarchy placed, even if a curator is very important or the museum is very important. All my projects, small and big, people are always surprised how much I meddle in small projects. And they're equally important because they're about your learning, your journey. And so bring importance to your own voice, your own sensibility. Do not worry about what is allowed and what is not allowed. This is not the time to do that. And I don't know if there is a time where you really do that to that point of really censoring yourself, which is very different than editing yourself. Do listen to voices that edit, because editing is what I do even when I'm looking at my own images of my work from, you know, 2000. I would have made this differently. I would have done that, this work. But editing allows you to make your work closer to where you are at the time. And you can never chase it like a tail, you know, because you always never grasp it. So I think that's really important to feel playful about.
And another thing that has always intrigued me with both Romita, we had a talk about it earlier, that when you were in art colleges and universities and all that, and even now, I mean, what are your views on the gender issues in the arts? Because gender, we were talking about it, that only 4% of women artists, their works are in collections of museums. And we have a project called SEMA Awards, where we get only 20% applicants from women. Though, mind you, the enrollment of women in art institutions are almost 50-50. But when it comes to, going in for these massive, where you have to promote yourself, you have to go out and meet people and do things, somehow women, they somehow don't do it. So do you feel that, do you have a message as a woman artist to, the way that women have to now counter the art world? I mean, definitely we are lagging behind.
We have a very exciting future ahead of us to see women participate. It is the most difficult position to be in as a woman in the world. The whole world, as you saw with my alligator's mouth, holding on to the globe. Men are holding on to the globe. And so we're really in a position where we need to pluck that globe away from their mouth and allow it to be shared. And it is such a struggle for women to have opportunities, to even feel they have free time to really make their work. I don't know how to tell you, even in this pandemic, I'm Zooming my friends who are women of great privilege, and they are working people in the world. And during this time where we're doing online work and we're at home, I'm seeing them fend for their family, their groceries, getting dinner on the table, washing dishes with their PhDs in hand, while their spouse is doing maybe 10% of the work at home. And so we're always in this position of asking men to share and take pleasure in their families in the way that we have, and to share in the labor of creating culture. There is so much that women make already that they're not credited for, and unless they're credited for it, they can't feel the confidence to enter the world, to enter into opportunities. I literally have to call young women on the phone and say, I'm going to apply to this with you. I'm writing down your name on this application. You will apply to this college. You will apply for this learning situation, or go to this event. We have to encourage and push and nudge each other. And we have to make each other feel welcome. And it is very easy to say that from where I'm standing now, but the struggles I went to, especially with large sculpture in foreign countries, where in India or in Japan or wherever I was, I may be considered Indian wherever I go, even though I'm here in the US, but I'm always first seen as a woman. And so making and building work, I cannot tell you how often people have told me that women are not really artists. They just make things. And I think that is the overriding sentiment about women and creativity, that they are animals that are creative, but they're not humans that create. And this is very ironic for a good reason, because they do make those lives that are out there, those children, to make the world, and yet they don't have the credit of making culture. And I think this is something we're always struggling with. And I think the future holds so many surprises, but you literally have to snatch those possibilities to help you be a participant in the world. And I think where there aren't enough participants, you have to talk to both men and women to teach them how to make opportunities real, and to shape those opportunities. Maybe the opportunities themselves are not the right kind to invite women. And so we have to rethink everything in multiple possibilities of not only gender, but also in terms of race, class, caste, and village versus city. And I think important projects don't have to happen in the cities always. They can happen in villages. And these are things we're struggling with now in the United States, as I said, with the Whitney Biennial, to include other states and not be the center of the world always as one anchor. And I think to have the future means decentralizing everything.
And now coming more or less to the end of my queries to you, and The symbiotic relationship that we had spoken earlier between curators and galleries and the artists, which is, it's something that has to be built up. Particularly in India, we don't have a vibrant gallery culture like you have abroad. There are very few galleries, very few art institutions, hardly any foundations. So the artists are literally left in the lurch, to fend for themselves. So, in this kind of scenario, what is the kind of things that you would have to advise our young artists, and especially what kind of a role do you think the galleries can play in this respect?
I think the most hardest thing for me to learn, both as an Indian growing up in the United States, was how to socialize with people who are different from me. Everyone I came across in what we call the art world here was not Indian. And even amongst that, the people with authority and opportunities were not women. And so for a time in my education, learning how to create relationships that endure and you keep up with. It's hard work to have a relationship. You have to really push yourself to learn how to talk to a variety of people. I can literally say that was the most valuable thing I've learned, is to how to access people in terms of intimacy. It was also a way for me to fuel the meaning of my work, to understand different places, different experiences. I don't have to have all those experiences myself. If you're in intimate with a relationship with someone, their experience feels like your own, and I think that is an amazing thing, this empathy that human beings have. It breaks all boundaries, male, female boundaries, race, class, and that is what you need to tap into, that we're all gifted with. And if you can tap into that, is the center of your strength as an artist, a desire, aching desire to share who you are and what you've experienced, but also to learn of the rest of the world. And there's nothing else that happens in real life except that, these exchanges between human beings. So it's really one project that we're all in, whether we're artists or not. How do we make the most of our time here in a way that feeds us, wants us to, makes us want to get up in the morning and rush out our door and do our work? And, we're so enlightened by this communication level that we've aspired to with the internet, that we can see each other and talk to each other and reckon with large distances across oceans and now distances because of disease. We're able to overcome that. How lucky we are we have this, that we can really pursue what we want to with the intimacy we'd like in this way. So this was new to my generation. We didn't have internet. We couldn't share visual images. You have a social media platform which still desires your shaping so that it can be more than what it is. These are the things that we need to think about in creating friendships. I have friendships with artists who live in Brazil that I've never met. I've made friendships with artists that live upstate New York that I never met. And then 10 years later, after so many text messages, I meet her at a project and we hugged each other and said, "Did you know we never met and we were friends?" And we talk to each other now, even less on text and more on phone. And it's pretty amazing that you can have these kinds of friendships because you've connected in some way. And I think human beings transmit this sense of wanting to be in the world. And if you can do that, if you're open to doing that, and you feel secure in doing that, that's a treasure. And that will really make many paths happen for you. That's all people want to know, that you want to be with them.
Now, 3 tips for our young artists and emerging artists. Very short, but 3 tips from you which will inspire them.
I think one of the important things in creating ideas for yourself is your own family, your experiences in childhood, but also in those experiences to be self-critical, to realize what you didn't have, what was hurtful, what was painful to endure, and to bring that to the foreground to talk about. No matter how many kind of inferences to censorship you might have, you'd be surprised the very things you've struggled with is what we want to know. Do not be swayed so much about the way the world is making art. The world is actually waiting for you to make art differently than what they're making. And so I think it's really important to stay true to what you love to do and how you like to use your hands, or maybe not use your hands at all. Everything is possible. Your work does not have to look like mine in order to achieve a sense of fulfillment and success. And you're the one who has to define what that success is. It doesn't matter if you're in the most important biennials or the most insignificant ones. It is what you put into your project has to come through.
Thank you, Rina. So now I think is the time for the question answers. So do we have, Romita, have you got some questions with you?
Yes, I do. So thank you for that wonderful conversation. We're having multiple addas and conversations, which is great fun. So on to the first question, which actually arrived yesterday from Professor Emeritus John Jisha. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name, from the School of Art and Design in North Carolina. And he has several questions knitted together. I'm going to ask just one of his questions. What should be the role of educators, the business community, and galleries in developing opportunities for social practice art forms?
So Romita, which part of this question would you like to take?
I'm not taking this question, my dear. You and Rakhi will take this question.
So, you know, I have to say that things have really changed in the museum. Educational programs become much more integrated with the artists that they have invited. Previously, education systems in museums would have their own educators and there was no interaction. What I'm seeing as an artist now, because our interest is in social practices and social justice, people are asking artists to come and be with the 10-year-olds and 5-year-olds in an educational program. And that's very valuable, I think, to be able to not only guide patrons, but a whole range of people. So opening up who can participate and also bring the museum or the gallery or the artist to location. We can travel, and we're happy to be in an unusual setting. New ideas are being brought forward where we come to not only classrooms, but different groups of people. And the other thing I think is very essential is workshops. So previously, workshops were often with studio practice students in colleges. And now I'm seeing workshops being made, you know, if you want to bring an artist, they're not only going to studio practice, they're going into art history, maybe they're going to a history class, maybe a social science class. I've even brought my art into a science class to talk about my work and science. So art really can be about huge topics that concern all subject area. And I think that the isolation that I've experienced in my generation between disciplines being separated is now being merged. And I think that is an important achievement for us today that needs more work and more flowering to really merge also the hierarchies we place between different institutions being very important and smaller institutions that are in communities that are less important, to bring those bridges together, that we interact with each other and we learn from each other. And that will open, I think, those kinds of access points in terms of social practice and art forms. When you include more people, you will have more types of art. And I think the role of an artist is to be an educator. I think that's what I do with other artists, both younger, older. You know, you'd be surprised. There is a community of artists who are older than me that I've learned from, but I also teach them what's happening, you know, with younger generations and my generation. And so this flow between generation, I'm really tired of seeing exhibitions where everybody's the same age, but we have diversity, supposedly, or we have a cohesiveness around a theme like Indian art, African art, diaspora art. I think to have work really send the message the work is important because people are important means choosing the work that is talking to each other in a certain way. And that means dispelling with this kind of monumental visibility of a particular group that we often go to because there's a lack of opportunity. So I don't have the answer to how one does that. I think that will finally fall in the laps of both the educators and curators and museums to figure that out. But I don't think artists get together because they're all the same age and they're all Indian. That's not how it's happening in the West. And so artists do get together and converse and influence each other because they're friends. And they're friends for reasons that are not obvious to us. And I think that natural diversity and that natural inclination to find a relationship with someone is something that we need to see in the exhibition scale as a place to visit what is happening in the world, but also in classrooms. Classrooms are divided by age as well. And I think, could there be a way to integrate different levels of learning so that when you go out in the world, there is no like sixth grade is here and 12th grade is here and freshmen are here. That doesn't happen in the real world. So I'm always pushing to really close the gap in terms of the isolation of generational groups. And I think that is something we often overlook, that I think more about now that I'm getting older. You know, what can I do to insert myself with younger artists as well as older artists?
All right, so that takes me, Rakhi, since we're running a little bit behind time, I'm going to skip over to the next question, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so a question, since we're still on the subject of museums and how you insert yourself into the art world, a question from Natalie Bano. I'm just going to ask her first question and then move on specifically to questions about your work in particular. So her question is, do you feel that you still have a lot of freedom in your art, even when working on a piece in a prominent museum? Are there times when you feel limited artistically because there is a specific message that you want to express?
I think, you know, the interesting thing about a message is the message is always more complicated than it realizes. And I think the pleasure for me of incorporating a message is how rigid the message or topic or subject appears. So I'm an artist that is interested in making things much more, I would say, complicated, but also the complication is what reveals it, reveals the subject. And so I really think that now with more experience, I feel more freedom more freedom to be critical. I'm less shy about it, certainly. But I think I've seen a lot too that's made me more confident. And I think seeing a lot is what finally allows you to speak. And when you've heard enough voices of variety, and say that, you know, it's not exactly how it appears, or, you know, I've seen it in a different way. And I think the kind of experience you have over a long period of time allows you to be a lot more humble to how messages are put to you. And in the context of making work, which allows you freedom, you're always pushing it. You're never satisfied that you have enough freedom. The beauty of freedom is you always feel like you can have more. And I think freedom works the way love works, that you feel like, oh yeah, I have a little bit, but I want more. And I think the more is better in this particular situation. Freedom has incredible responsibilities also that I think you have to be aware of. That's why it's such a pleasurable place to be, because it's the responsibility given to you when you take freedom. And so when I have the freedom to talk about a subject matter, I try to escape only being a person who represents a woman, who only represents being Indian, only represents being a New Yorker, or only represents the US, or Kolkata, for example. You know, how do we acquire the freedom to be everywhere? That's real freedom. And how do we get there? How do we arrive to that level of feeling this whole earth is mine, and all the people in every place, every corner of the world, I can feel what they are feeling. And the desire to do that creates a sense of freedom and a sense of security. Even when you are lost, you are always at home. And so I think of freedom that way, that kind of wandering and still being in our house, in our home, you know, on the earth. And we haven't arrived there, and I'm hoping for that. And I hope you will hope for that with me. I think that's what artists love to bring to their studio.
Okay, so now on to some questions about your work in particular. So Susan Bean, I think you've worked with her in the past at the Peabody Essex Museum, has a question for you. I experience the Gharial and Burnt Globe as a work of luscious beauty, as well as of darkness and playful humor. Can you address that rather paradoxical juxtaposition?
I think with every kind of beauty, there is the strength of the beauty, but there is always this fear of it being either taken away from you or it disappearing or dying. And death is something that we experience, but we don't feel that we can express the experience of death. That is one of the experiences that we will have in our life, that we won't have time after death to experience it and to share that experience. It's one of the contradictions of experience that has its limits. And I think that the way we overcome it is we experience change, the change from time to time, from losing a space that you thought you were familiar with and entering into unfamiliar territory. And it creates a certain kind of death that you imagine. And so we work in almost this kind of metaphorical way to experience more than we can. And I think this particular work, Burnt Fruit, for me, you know, there's nothing more cherished than food and flour in a household, especially in my household. You know, when my mother would do the puja, I was enamored by the puja room where she would bring fruit, and with time, when she offered it to a deity, it would die. And I would think as a child, did she eat the fruit? Why are we letting it go to waste? But really what I wanted to say to my mom was, I want the fruit. You know, I don't want it to be left there to go to waste. So the sense of economy with things that are treasured is very present in my work. Something that is alive and something that is dead. When you work with objects, you realize they don't have life in them, like the way, you know, we were quoted as worshiping idols. So that kind of reference to idols are very much entrenched in the work or invested in it. You know, the psychological experience of this intimate relationship with an inanimate object to make it come to life is a sense of projection that we do with everything, you know, that is not alive, can be alive. So everything from the mountains to rivers to things that are crafted, they're alive because there was a hand on it and there was life on it, even though we don't suggest that by the way we think of science. And I think that with Burned Fruit and with some of the other works, even the Pink Taj and the Prospect for Peace, Viola, it is very much a part of meeting up with death when you talk about history itself, right? Things that have passed and conjuring up the future. And so life and death are always so intertwined in its experience with us that how can you talk about one without the other? And how can you talk about objects without talking about death, you know? Objects really, we hope, live forever because we don't.
Wonderful. We're going to just take two more questions, Rina, because we have about 4 minutes left before, but it's 9:30 in India right now. So we'll just keep an eye on that. So we have a question in Bangla from Biki Kaur, and I'm going to translate from you for it for you, where the question is, do you think that political views are always expressed by artists in their work? Or in other words, is expressing a political view really important for an artist's work at any given moment?
There is the experience of having an opinion and a viewpoint, a philosophical one, an emotional one, cultural one. These are political places in our minds. We have ideas about them before the word is or the thoughts are made into policy and politics. Politics is about culture. It's about family. How can you not have an opinion about what should happen to your children, what should happen to your grandparents, what is the quality of their life? So I think often we divorce political events from that genuine experience we have with everyday life. And I think that's dangerous. All our work has invested in it, ideological, political views. Sometimes we may or may not be aware of it because there is a complexity of translation. It's a complexity of, can we be self-critical? At what point are we complete? And we can't be complete in being self-critical. And so I think to be open to the politics that are in the artwork we see is very important to our freedom.
So on to the last question now, Rina, that comes from Arundhati Ray, who's actually my mother. So I'll reserve a question for the last one, which I believe is about the Taj Mahal, if I'm not mistaken. She says, I'm wondering how you would accept an average Indian mind that has always seen white, but it's not. Will you think they will accept it? And if so, why?
I think the idea of accepting is a very complex experience in itself. I think when things are dissimilar to where the origin is a very, it's a big thought to think about. Origin is what I'm questioning when I'm thinking about why we even have the event of thinking of diaspora, why we have the event of thinking where we're from in our passports. And to change something that has an original birth is to question origin itself, why we have to mark everything with origin. You were from this family, this is your family name, this is your father's name. So all those things are embedded in what I think is the pink Taj Mahal about nationalism. I think that we can never arrive at the origin, that once we've seen the actual moment when Rina Banerjee or someone else who lives across the street from the Taj Mahal sees something, it escapes us. And this continuous desire to make origin static is our refusal of death. And I think that when we refuse death, it doesn't allow us to live forever. And in fact, it makes our lives that much shorter when we refuse death. And so this is a very rich place to talk about how we manage to make value out of our life. And it is with this idea of this is where it starts and this is where it begins. This is where you were born, and you cannot go beyond these boundaries in this country. And should you want to live in XYZ, you have to go through this treacherous kind of landscape to get there, which could be, you know, paperwork. But essentially, we are always putting hurdles in front of us to really make origin a static thing when it is not. We don't know where the origin of everything is. That is finally what we're very uncomfortable with.
So wonderful. I just want to keep an eye on our time. Do we have time for one more question, Rakhi? I just saw a question.
I'm fine. It's 9 o'clock here, so it's
okay. Sorry. All right. So Motoshi Chakraborty has asked if you could talk about a correlation between your drawings and installations. Please explain the difference of approach. And that's the last question that I will take, by the way. So, so go ahead, Rina, if you can comment on that, please.
Well, I think in the beginning, when I started to make, you know, I studied painting and drawing at school. I in no way was only invested in painting and drawing when I started my educational process. I love materials, I loved fabric, that's what I grew up with. And textiles and objects are in the work. It may be in the two-dimensional work. I think all work is finally figurative in some sense. I imply that. I think that the objects that we see in the sculptures echo, whether it's the globe or the ball or the arc or the canopy, you know, these are metaphors. The wings in the figure here that are actually constructed. It's really, for me, there is no such thing as these disciplines between installation, sculpture, and two-dimension. They're all the same thing. You know, it's just, these are places in which there are restrictions made by the tools we use as we experience them today, but we're entering a digital period which allows another discipline to come to play. And so a discipline that is time-oriented and has implied depth because of space being counted in video work, for example. And I think that that kind of destroyed that imaginary place where we thought the two-dimensional was separate from the three-dimensional. I think what is real is our bodies have pretty much stayed the same. And so when we walk around a sculpture, we see it from multiple perspectives. And that allows our experience to be unique between you and I. That we can say, because I'm seeing it through the side of my eye, or seeing it through these glasses, or I don't see very well, or I'm this short and you're this tall. We experience sculpture in our bodies, connected to something that is almost as large as our body. So scale, I think, is more fascinating to me, as you can see with my big work, to think about as differences. And I think when we experience two-dimensional work, let's say a drawing or painting, we imagine that is three-dimensional. We enter the, what we call the window of the parameters of our rendering, whether it's shallow or has depth, doesn't matter. I think there was a preoccupation that if things were flat in a drawing that you didn't enter, but that's really not true for myself. I enter it in my imagination because, like any language, it allows your entry. And so the language we develop in these mediums can be the same language, but, you know, said with different kind of things that are in space that relate to our bodies, I think. So I hope I answered that question. I'm not sure.
So I think, have we finished with all our questions and answers? Okay. Well, just like the title of this conversation, which Rina, in fact, created, I hope we have exposed a little bit and experienced the thrill of deviating from the center. We have learned through Romita's sensitive portrayal how Rina's heart, mind, and soul has blended seamlessly, how her visual story of memories, histories, and lost civilization unites the world, how her works resonate of a deep empathy for people and their varied cultures. Hope all the young artists who have joined us today following today's conversation got an opportunity to glimpse Rina's artistic journey. Thank you, Romita, for unfurling Rina's mind and her inner world. Both of you have had long experiences of teaching. I don't know if one can truly teach art, but one can definitely reveal some of the secrets and magics of an imaginative mind and how it shapes new ways of looking at life and its underladen truths. Thank you very much, both of you. And thank you to all our attendees, and particularly to all our young artists. I hope this has been good for all of us, and look forward to many more sessions in the COVID times. Till then, goodbye, sayonara, good night, wherever you are. And of course, good day to ones who are sitting in the States and the other side of the oceans. It was lovely. And I think this would not have been possible had the COVID not come. So at least the flip side of COVID is that we are all meeting, and I hope we can do that more frequently. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
Pleasure to meet all of you, and having this opportunity to come together and to create something together was very enjoyable and very memorable for me.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Rakhi. Thanks, Rina.